Quad66. Alright, I've got a new tune for you. So this is specifically for these really lightweight 65mm builds, and to get them this way you're pretty much going to have to use an 0702 motor and some minimal canopy and things like that. But I got this dry weight build down to 8.5 grams, and with my preferred battery, which is the NubiDrone Nitro Nectar 250. This is a 7-gram cell, and these are the good cells. These are the folded cells. I get this to a 25.5 gram all up weights. Now I've got this tuned, and I'm particularly confident in this tune because I've got it tuned with a built-in black box. So finally Betaflight did us a solid and dropped a 1S board with a built-in black box, which really helps a lot. It gives me a lot of confidence in terms of looking at the noise profile of the tune and not worrying that as I put an open logger on and off the thing that I'm not messing up things unintentionally by moving stuff around and having different weights in different places. Now, to get down to this weight, you're making some compromises. With the frame, you got to use one of these Meteor 65 frames, which aren't the most, they're not the most robust thing. There's definitely a little bit more noise in them. Got to use a minimalist canopy, and so this is the canopy I came up with. The STL file is available free on the Ko-fi site. There's a link down below if you like this style canopy. And it fits really well with these slightly shorter board cams, so like the 199C or the pinch cam. As I said, 0702 motors, and what that means is that this gets down to a weight where I find it really easy to fly, and it's a combination of the power band of the 0702 motor and the weight where I find it really easy to control the height of the quad, and I don't have too much momentum going into the turns where it's not really pushing and drifting. I find it really easy kind of get it to rail those corners, and the punch out's great. This acros, this freestyle is just fine. It'll catch out of split S's and dives and power loops, and there's no washout, no problems like that. Obviously we're making some some of those compromises, but on the flip side, this isn't as compromised as some of the builds because I am using this 4-hole mounted Betaflight board, and it does not have an integrated VTX, so I'm using a separate VTX. And that does a couple things. One is that with the separated VTX, it's going to be a little bit more weight, but you got more options to drive up the power. And then the other thing is with this Betaflight board, this has built-in Express LRS, but it is not the SPI. It's actually the new UART implementation, which saves your processing power in F411. So you're not using it all on Express LRS. You're using it where you want to, which is being able to run the higher PID loop rates, and also being able to run RPM telemetry, ESC telemetry, so RPM filter, dynamic idle, all that good stuff without running out of headroom on your CPU. Now this particular board does have the BMI 270 gyro, so that also saves a little bit. That's 3.2K versus an MPU 6000, which you might want to run at 8K, 4K. The motors, a little bit underwhelmed in terms of the smoothness. These are quite rattly, and I'll show you in the black box that when I first built this quad, I was really pretty underwhelmed with the flight time. I was getting a little over 2 minutes, maybe 2 minutes 30 seconds tops. And what I figured out, because I had integrated black box, is I took a look at the noise, and I had this big old noise problem. And with a little bit of tweaking on the filters, got that under control, and that saved me easily 30-40 seconds, and now I can easily get well over 3 minutes on this particular build. Other little quirks about this build, I am on PH2 solid pin connectors, and I think that's just fine. If you're getting 3 minutes out of a 250 battery, you're not pushing a whole lot of amps through there, and so PH2 solid pin and Kia's solid pin is going to do just fine. It's going to be able to get, it's going to do just as well as like a BT2 or GNB27 because you give up little voltage, but you get it right back in the weight savings. And so overall, perfectly happy with that combination, which is important because on these 250s, I think you can only get them with the PH2. Obviously, a lot of people are going to be running 300s, so if you're using tinywhip.com or I think Tattoo and a couple other brands, We Bleed FPV also use these folded cell. Maybe you're on BT2, and that's fine too. I think that's really what I have to say. I mean, this Whoop finally is what I've kind of like always wanted in a Whoop. We always want more, but this I'm really, really satisfied with and really having a fun time flying. So I wanted to get you a good tune, and I think I've got it there. And so now I'll jump over into the black box and Betaflight and show you all those details with that.
Okay, jumping into logs, the first thing I wanted to show you was the difference that optimizing the filtering made. So this I use sort of a baseline filtering strategy, and it's a very aggressive strategy, very low latency. But what you can see here is this giant volcano of noise. Your signal is all down here, and everything upstream, higher frequencies of this these very low areas is all going to be noise. And in fact, a bunch of this is actually noise too. This is not even your signal in here either. I made some tweaks to the filtering. Definitely a little bit of compromise in terms of giving up some latency, but not enough to where I was noticing a bunch of prop wash problems. And this is the after effect right here. You can see how all that giant red volcano is gone. I do have a little problem down here. These motors, these Happy Model motors in particular, are pretty rattly. Yeah, I've beaten them on them a little bit, but nothing terrible. But there's enough funny little rattle that I'm getting this low frequency noise. And you just, with the filtering, you can't do anything about this. This is just too low to even try and filter. One of the things I did with the filtering strategy, and I'll show you in Betaflight, the settings. Normally what I do is use the dynamic notches, but since I have black box, I could see exactly where the noise was. And so I took one of my dynamic notches. Instead of using two of those, I'd put one as a static notch and then just left one dynamic notch. And so I was able to drop the static notch right where the worst of the noise was. And that really helped us a lot, in addition to doing some other changes like pushing up the D-term or pushing down the D-term slider to bring the D-term in, filtering in earlier at lower frequencies. So I'll go through the setup more in Betaflight, but I did want to show you just how dramatic of a difference I made, before and after. And just by changing up my filtering, as informed by black box, I was able to pick up 30 to 35, 40 seconds of flight time. And so it went from a quad that I was like, I don't know if I'm going to fly for just 2 minutes if I'm satisfied with that, to getting over 3 minutes and, to a flight time that I'm satisfied with. So, yeah, black box log really helps, even on these little micros. In terms of how this tune looks, so now we're looking at the traces. What you want to see is that these two lines overlap. The blue and the purple here, or purple and the green, is my pitch, and then the red and the yellow is my roll. So starting off looking at some twitch moves. So these are twitch moves back and forth on the pitch. You can see how well we're tracking. There's no big deviations of the set point away from, or the gyro away from the set point, staying right on it. Now, when we do push this into full flips, just, jamming the stick all the way forward, let's get to one. You can see on pitch, it struggles a little bit, so it's not staying quite there, but this is pretty good, especially for a Whoop on the pitch axis, because most of our weight's on the pitch axis, because that's where the battery is. You can see how we're doing okay. And I left this here because I felt my twitch moves were good enough on the pitch axis, and the only time we're seeing a little struggle is when we go into these full flips. And for me, that's kind of a lesser thing. And what I'd rather do is not to push this up. We could get rid of this. We could keep pushing things up, but then you're really going to have a lot of D-term. You're going to bring that noise back up, and you're going to start sacrificing flight time. And I thought that this was a very fair compromise. Now, when we go over to a slightly easier access to control, which is the roll, that is just astoundingly beautiful for a Whoop. I mean, the way this on this full snap roll, this is like absolutely incredible to get out of this tiny little Whoop. So this really came out really, really well. And this is in fact doing this well, even though my gains are lower on the roll axis. I put more gains on the pitch axis, but even at these lower gains, to kind of help with that D-term noise, to keep it down, this is tracking extremely well on these snap rolls. In terms of twitch moves, look just as good. You can see that the tracking is really well. It's staying right on the twitch moves. and I'm hitting it with some pretty hard twitch moves, staying right on there. So that looks great. Let's go over now into Betaflight, and I'm going to show you the details of the tune. Alright, so I got the quad plugged into Betaflight. First thing I want to show you, if you're not familiar with where to get the presets, what you do is you go to your presets tab. I've got another video, it's linked below, and I've also got my information in terms of how to get my preset. But basically what you want to do is you want to grab my URL and my GitHub branch, and you add that as a new resource and you make it the active resource. Once this is the active resource, then go ahead and select that. In the search bar to clean out, because I don't have just my stuff, I have some other things in there too. But if you want to see just my presets, just type in Quad66 in the search bar. Make sure all of these, select all, so that way you get all of them. And then you'll get all of my tunes and setup stuff here. So if you want to use this tune, the first thing I suggest is you go ahead and grab the setup for the Whoop. This kind of sets up some things like overclocking the CPU on F411s. With my Whoop, it does have the accelerometer active versus my regular base setup does not have accelerometer active. Then you want to go ahead and grab this particular tune, and so this is going to be the 65mm Acro Race Whoop with the 0702s. You want to grab that. And if you are flying a similar build, you probably want to grab my filters, which is going to be the filter settings for a not so clean Whoop. Now, if you've got a very clean Whoop, you can try my very clean build with RPM filtering. If it's not so clean, then go over here and grab that one. So what does that get you? The things it gets you is on in your setups, in your configuration. If you're on a MPU 6000 or ICM gyro, that would give you 8K, 4K. In the case of the BMI 270, which this particular quad is flying, gives you 3K or 3.2, 3.2K. The accelerometer is on, and it does overclock the CPU, which you can see if you go into your settings. Then in terms of the major stuff in the PID, this is where we end up with it. So overall, what you can see here is the master multiplier. I'm pushing that up some, and then pushing up basically across the board on my PI, basically PI, D, and feed forward. And they're all actually symmetrical, which is kind of interesting because it's basically stock Betaflight actually has pretty good ratios between all of these. And so effectively all we're doing is just pushing this all up between the master multiplier and the PI and D. If you're used to looking numbers, you can see where this got us. It got us into, the high 80s to low 100s on P. Integrals, you can see where those landed, 160, 190. Our D, I don't use Dmax, so I've got this set up where Dmax and just the regular D are going to be the same. And you can see we're in the 60 to high 70 range, feed forward, 240 to 280 kind of range. You can see how much more I have on pitch. You can see how the gains are quite a bit higher on pitch. And where that comes in is turning up the pitch D and turning up the pitch tracking, which is the PI and feed forward. And you can see those are both pushed up at 1.15. Other things I have in here. Forgot on the configuration, air mode is off. So for whoops, to keep them from getting stuck on the walls, it turns off air mode. On here you can see our feed forward settings, which is pretty aggressive. And by aggressive, what we're doing here is the smoothness is fairly low, and we're using 2-point averaging. That lets that feed forward kind of jump early and help us out. We are using dynamic idle, and in this case I have this maxed out, so it's 100 times 100, so that's 10,000 RPM for our dynamic idle. VBAC compensation, you absolutely want to use that, and I absolutely recommend putting it right at 100%. If you are using VBAC compensation, you got to make sure that your battery settings in terms of your minimum are actually accurate, because you don't want to set the way it does VBAT. It uses this to that sag compensation. It uses this value to calculate that. So you want to make sure that you have your minimum voltage where you actually land. So I am using that VBAT sag compensation. Thrust linearization of about 30% I've found to be pretty good on this. And then on our filters, this is what I had to do to kind of get this quad going. What I found about filtering is using a little bit of everything seems to work better than doubling up or tripling up on any one thing. So that's kind of how I got to this strategy. So in general, we're pretty aggressive because you can see our gyro multiplier. We slid it all the way right. I did leave on this gyro low pass too, which you can probably turn this off on the BMI gyro. The BMI gyro has such high filtering built in that you really don't need this. You can probably turn that off. I left it on here just for safety's sake. What I did have to do is I had to use more D-term filtering than I often do on the slider. This is still pretty aggressive by all means. This is at 1.5. You know, stock is 1, right? So we are pushing this pretty aggressively, but not nearly as aggressive as I often do on my cleaner builds. Then some things moving away from kind of like defaults and stock. On the whoops, they're not really so motor band dominant, so you want to use the RPM filter, but I don't really see much reason to use any more than one harmonic because the flight controllers and everything, they're just so noisy and there's so much stuff going on that you're better off using filtering in other places rather than using 3 harmonics. I think 1 harmonic is plenty on the RPM filter. If you don't have black box, in this case I would use 2 notches. But what I did is instead of using 2 dynamic notches, I took one of those notches, turned it off here, and then I put in a static notch. And so you can see where I put in this D-term notch filter, a static one. I put a center frequency at 230 and a cutoff at 200. And that was right in the center of the noise that I was having. One of the things to keep in mind with dynamic notches, especially if you're not using a whole ton of RPM filters, like if you're not using full 3 harmonics, you got to make sure that you let these dynamic notches go high enough, and so you can see that the minimum is 100, and I've kicked up the max frequency from around 600, which I think is, you know, the default, up to 900, to make sure that we're not losing control in the higher frequencies. If you keep this at 600, you are probably going to get some noise up in those higher frequencies. The last couple filter things to find will go under the hood, and we'll talk about a couple other changes under the hood here. So first one is I'll show you the CPU overclock. So that Whoop base setup, you can see for the F411, I've overclocked this up to 120 megahertz. The other things that are under the hood are going to be the RPM filter Q. Let's see. There's the RPM filter Q. And you can see here that I have narrowed that Q down to 750. I think default is 500. Yeah, default value is 500. So I've narrowed that down to 750, and that saves us just a little bit of latency. So that's what we have here. Oh, other thing, motors tab. So that base setup is going to put props out. So just make sure that you're running props out. We're on D-Shot 300. And then I've got in that base setup, you can see that I put in motor poles 12 and the bidirectional D-Shot is on. So make sure that you have an ESC firmware that has bidirectional D-Shot because we are using the RPM filter and a dynamic idle, and so you need that feature available. All right, so again, go ahead, grab my presets. get my resource in there. And so this information is down the link below. Also, I'll link to a video where I go a little bit more about presets and how to use those. All right, till next time, cheers.